January 28, 1986, Cape Canaveral, Florida. In the early hours, the temperature has done something that it isn't supposed to do in the Sunshine State. It has plummeted. On Launch Pad 39B, the Space Shuttle Challenger is draped in an unnatural white. Icicles, some nearly a foot long, hanging from the service structure like frozen teeth. For the ground crew walking the pad, the air feels more like a Moscow winter than a Florida morning. 600 miles to the north, in the government offices of Washington, the clocks are ticking toward a public relations triumph. For the first time, the state is sending a citizen to the stars. Christa McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from New Hampshire. She isn't a pilot or a physicist. She is the face of a new era where space is routine. But as the sun rises over the Atlantic, the calculation inside NASA is hitting a breaking point. The engineers are worried. They are looking at a temperature 36 degrees below the limit for the shuttle's rubber seals. But the management culture is under pressure. There is a State of the Union address tonight, and there is a schedule to keep. In a matter of minutes, the measured world of engineering safety will be crushed by the weight of political ambition. As the engines ignite, the old certainties of the space age will die, and a new, violent lesson in leadership will be born in the Florida sky. This is Leadership on the Brink. Episode 1, The Challenger Disaster. The voice of launch control is calm, professional, almost clinical. But behind that calm, the Roger Commission would later reveal a system in total internal conflict. This launch was the centerpiece of the Teacher in Space program. NASA needed to prove that the shuttle was as safe as a commercial airliner. They had convinced the world that space was no longer a frontier, but a workplace. Christa McAuliffe was a symbol of routine space. She was supposed to give lessons from orbit to millions of children watching in their classrooms. It was a masterpiece of soft power. But according to the NASA Rogers Commission report, the leadership had spent years practicing what they called the normalization of deviance. They knew the O-ring seals on the rockets were flawed. They had seen them erode in previous flights. But because they hadn't failed yet, the leadership convinced themselves that they never would. They were leading based on luck rather than logic. At 11:38 a.m. in the morning, Challenger lifts off. For 72 seconds, it looked like another victory for the American plan. Then, the sky breaks. But to understand why NASA took such a gamble in 1986, we have to look back at the culture that was built for them. The space race wasn't born out of a love for science. It was a proxy for the Cold War. It was a race to prove which system of leadership, Moscow or Washington, was superior. The timeline provided by the Royal Museum's Greenwich shows us that the Brink began on October the 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. It was a tiny metal sphere, but its signal, heard on radios across the globe, sent a shockwave through to the West. It proved that Moscow had rockets capable to reach the United States of America. This led me to my conversation with history teacher Jack Grinter, speaking about Sputnik 1.
Yeah, I mean, everything about the Cold War is about, ideology, about keeping pace, about trying to outdo the other side, and we see that, and the space race becomes a key part of that, isn't it? So it becomes, for NASA it was like, and for America it was a real part of pride, wasn't it, and making sure they could actually show that they were ahead of the Soviet Union, because when we look back further, don't we see the Soviet Union got the first man into space, America got the first man onto the moon. It was all about doing the thing to keep ahead, wasn't it? So yeah, I can understand why they wanted to do it differently. But it's like anything in life, isn't it? You can't just keep doing the same things over and over again. So they wanted to have this space mission, didn't they, to show the world how they were the dominant force in terms of the space race. But as you mentioned with Sputnik, that would have sent shockwaves to Washington, wouldn't it, in terms of keeping pace with them or keeping ahead of them.
The timeline of the next decade was a series of firsts. It forced the leadership in Washington into a state of permanent crisis. April 1961. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space. Moscow was winning. The management culture in the US responded with the Apollo program, a massive top-down mobilization of resources. The objective was no longer just exploration. It was survival of the image. By the time Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in July 1969, a specific kind of leadership leadership had been forged. It was a culture that believed any engineering problem could be solved with enough money, enough pressure, and enough of a can-do attitude. But as the 1970s turned into the 1980s, that attitude turned into something more dangerous: institutional ignorance. I spoke to Kate Arkless Grey, and she said that what caused the Challenger disaster was not only a failure of engineering, but also a failure of communication.
Now, what caused the Challenger disaster was not only a failure of engineering, but a failure of communication. And I think that's not something that is unique to the space industry. In fact, large organizations, they may say they have warning systems in place, perhaps whistleblower protections, but if things at the end of the day rely on the right person being heard at the right time, then issues can slip through. And we've seen this, for example, with the NHS. If people have had concerns about surgeons or issues and they've not been heard, it can lead to the loss of life. So there are lessons that can be learned from this disaster that are important right across all different industries. Communication is incredibly important. Don't lose sight of the priorities, and for human spaceflight, that is keeping your crew safe, bringing them home safely. There may be times where you are having to make some very difficult decisions, and it'll be a matter of balancing several different things, and there will be times where you have to accept risk. It's just ensuring that when you're making those decisions about the level of acceptable risk, the person making the decision has to have all of the available information at their fingertips. And the launch officials that were making that final go for launch call on Challenger, they did not know that there had been dissenting views at Thiokol. And that was an issue that it sits with the management team at Thiokol, who decided to overrule their engineers that did have some concerns. That comes down to a number of things. I mean, not only was there pressure from NASA to be launching these space shuttles regularly and reliably, but also Thiokol themselves as a contractor, they faced a large fine, $10 million, if a launch was delayed because of their solid rocket boosters. And at the time of the disaster in 1986, their $800 million contract was up for renewal. The Challenger disaster really was a tragedy that rocked a nation, and especially with the teacher in space on board, with all those school children watching in their classrooms excitedly. And I think a lot of them will remember that moment until they die. It's a really harsh and stark reminder that we should never become complacent, especially when it comes to matters of life and death and human safety. Human spaceflight will never be safe. Space is hard, but there are things that we can do and processes that we need to ensure are working that will help to reduce the risk to the lowest possible number.
If the space race was about a large scale of politics, Challenger was more about the small scale of physics. We need to look at the reality of what happened on that pad. The shuttle wasn't one solid piece. It was a series of segments bolted together. The gaps between those segments were sealed by rubber O-rings. These seals are designed to expand and stop the hot, explosive gases from leaking out. But as the NASA Rogers Commission would later find out in Chapter 4 of their report, rubber has a physical limit. When it gets cold, it loses what they would call memory. It becomes stiff. It cannot seal that gap. The night before the launch, the engineers at Morthun Thiokol, the company that had built the rockets and held a desperate teleconference with NASA leadership, showed the data. They said, don't launch below 53 degrees. But the management culture pushed back. One NASA official famously asked the engineers, when do you want us to launch? Next April? This is the moment where the schedule became more important than science. The leadership pressured the engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats.
For them to believe it was enough to potentially delay a launch that had already been delayed and there was pressure to get it going. Also, with the penalties in place for Thiokol if it was found that it was their solid rocket boosters that were delaying the launch, all of these things would have fed into the way that management made the decision. And it's interesting to think, if they were wearing their engineering hat rather than their management hat, might they have been swayed a slightly different way?
Less than a second after the engine started, a first sign of disaster appeared. A small puff of dark smoke leaked out from the joint at the bottom of the right rocket. The rubber steel, frozen stiff by the Florida cold, had failed immediately. But for a few heartbeats, it seemed like the shuttle might survive. By a pure chance, the thick ash from the burning fuel acted like a temporary scab, plugging the hole. It was a lucky, accidental fix that bought the crew a few more seconds of life. Then, the shuttle hit the hardest part of the climb. This moment is called max Q, where the atmosphere pushes back against the ship with the most force. On this morning, the winds high above the coast were the strongest ever recorded. The shaking was too much. The scab of ash was ripped away, and the leak became a giant jet of fire. It acted like a blowtorch, cutting straight through into a massive bright orange fuel tank attached to the shuttle's belly. 73 seconds into the flight, the massive orange fuel tank finally collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of explosive fuel ignited into a terrifying bloom of white and orange. But in the center of that fire, the unthinkable happened. The crew cabin, the small room holding 7 human beings, was thrown clear. It remained intact. This is the hardest truth of the Challenger story. The crew didn't die in an instant. They were likely conscious as their cabin began a long, agonizing arc towards the ocean, over 40,000 feet below. We know this because when the wreckage was eventually found, several of their emergency oxygen packs had been turned on by hand. There would have been a terrible, heavy silence. A silence caused by a leadership culture that chose a launch schedule over human lives. 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the fire started, the cabin hit the water. In that moment, we didn't just lose a teacher and 6 brave astronauts. We lost an innocent age of the space race. The idea that these missions were routine died in the cold Atlantic, alongside 7 brave people who deserved a leadership as brave as they were. Challenger shows us what happens when a management culture becomes a religion. Whether it's the Kremlin ignoring the design flaws of Chernobyl, or NASA ignoring the physics of rubber, the pattern is the same. The brink is reached when leaders start believing their own propaganda over the voices of people who actually built the machines. The Roger Commission concluded that the disaster was rooted in history. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice made over 10 years of accepting small flaws until they became one big fatal one. Next time on Leadership on the Brink, we move from the Florida coast to the heart of the Soviet Union. We look at the elephant's foot and the hidden design flaws of Reactor 4. I'm Jamie.Mccreedy. Thank you for listening.